Everyone, welcome back to the last round of the Candidates Tournament. Today I'll be going over the game between Liren and Hikaru Nakamura. Um, so yeah, let's just get right into it. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and d5. Here white again has many options. He can play knight c3, he can play bishop f4, bishop g5, g3. Lots of options. Ding prefers to go with knight c3. Now c5, black enters a Tarrasch, or the semi-Tarrasch, I guess. I just call this a Tarrasch. This has been a very popular opening system between players like Karpov and Kasparov back in the World Championship matches. Today, Ding here played e3, which keeps attention for a little bit. There's a very well-known line here with c takes d5, c takes d4, queen takes, and at first glance, it looks like this is everything that white wants. But actually, in this endgame here, apparently black has good drawing chances. Although it does look like white is just much better with the bishop pair. But anyways, let's go back to this position here at e3. Black played knight c6, and now a3 was played. I always wondered what the point of this move is. I think it's just to prevent bishop b4 in some cases, and maybe also just prevent knight b4. And you never know, maybe b4 itself is actually a move. For example, if bishop e2, d takes c4, this has been played before. I mean, this is another way to play this position, and now bishop e4. But anyways, let's go back here. So a3 was played, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and now a6. There have been games where this was taken, and then it basically gave white an isolated pawn. But because of a3, which will prepare b4, as well as white quickly castling here, white should be more than okay here. So a6 was played with the intention to play b5. Very common idea, especially in positions with the Queen's Gambit accepted, where black takes on c4. Very similar idea. You just want to get b5 in, play bishop b7, and develop that way. So bishop d3, just preempting that, b5 anyways, and now d takes c5. White really doesn't want to allow c4 at some point, so taking this pawn is fine. Bishop takes, obviously. And now b4, Ding decides to just kick the bishop off its square. Now black has to decide where does he want to put the bishop. You could put it on b6, of course. That's a way to play this game. However, the problem is that the bishop might seem a little bit useless because the e3 and f2 square are actually pretty solid. So Naka decides to put it on e7. Now white just castles. Bishop b7, bishop b2, and we have this very symmetrical position where actually the pawns are exactly symmetrical. And usually in these kind of positions, a lot of pieces get exchanged, and it ends up being a draw. Basically, the rooks go to c1 and d1, the queens are off, and it turns out to be a draw. This game went a little bit differently though. So castles, knight e4. Ding is happy to exchange pieces, so this was taken, and now f5. And I think this was an indication that maybe Naka wanted to play for more. He could just play another move. I mean, he could also just maybe start with something like... interesting move here is actually knight a5, offering another exchange of pieces. But anyways, so Naka decided to just play f5, kicking the bishop. The bishop went all the way back to b1. I mean, I thought bishop c2 looked a little bit more natural just because it does the same thing as bishop b1, but at least the bishop can come to b3, and the rook can come to c1 pretty easily. So I don't know if bishop b1 is... Ooh, sorry, did not mean to go all the way to the end of the game. Happens. I use the arrows on my keyboard, so if I click the down arrow, it just hops to the end of the game. So bishop b1 here. The queens were exchanged. But you can kind of see how these rooks are not really connected for the moment. Now rook fd8. Now, I do want to go back for a second here. What happens if black just proceeds with something like rook c8? Looks very sensible. There's nothing wrong with this, by the way. It's just, these kind of positions, again, like I said, pieces get exchanged. Once the rooks are exchanged and all the pieces are off the board, this is usually a draw. It's just a very boring position to play, and I think that's why Naka decided to play f5 here. So the queens were exchanged, the rook came to d8, And now bishop a2. Again, I really do think that the bishop might have been a little better on b3, but we'll see the reason for that later. Okay, so king f7 was played just to cover the e6 pawn. Of course, it was under attack. This bishop was looking at it. Ding here played h4. The idea is to play knight g5, and basically if this is taken, black is going to have a hard time with that pawn because he can never play king g6, because then bishop takes d6 is an idea, and if h6 is ever played, then g6 comes, which is a check. And if king takes, then the e6 pawn falls as well. We'll see what I mean in a little bit. So h6 was played here, but let's say I just want to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So rook ac8. Let's say black plays this very natural-looking move, just ignoring the h pawn. Well, now knight g5 comes, and this is actually pretty annoying. If you play something like, if you go anywhere with the king, the e6 pawn drops. So this has to be taken, but now you can see how this pawn is actually quite annoying. Again, king g6 doesn't work because this is just taken. So what else can black do here? You can ignore this pawn, but then white might play something like f4, solidifying it, and you never know. The king might come around, and maybe white will start gunning on the h7 pawn. Especially with these two bishops aiming in this direction, you never know what kind of counterplay may be seen on the king side. So that is why, like for example, if something like h6, g6 is just a winning move because you knock off the e6 pawn, and suddenly this position is nothing but is everything but a draw. So white will be doing very well there. So instead of this, h6 was played. This wasn't to prevent anything or play g5. I mean, maybe, but it's really to just prevent knight g5 from coming. So good move. Rook dc1. I think Ding was also up for a fight because he could just play rook ac1. But then, that could lead to a lot of exchanges again with these rooks like this looking at each other. A lot of exchanges are bound to happen. So I think he played this move to avoid an exchange of pieces. Now rook takes rook is obviously not possible. So bishop d6 was played. Basically, maybe black wants to get an e5 at some point. You never know. I mean, this bishop is also better placed here than on h4. But rook c2 was played now, and Ding has this idea to play rook c2, rook c1, and pile up on the c file. And now knight e7 came, and maybe there was a better move here besides knight e7 that really shows you why these bishops are actually not well placed at all, or how the coordination of white's pieces isn't perfect. So for the moment, if you look at white's rooks, they're actually disconnected, and the bishops it looks like they're placed well, but after this move, a5, suddenly it shows that that white's position is not all that it seems. So let's say if white continues with his plan to just play rook ac1, a takes b4 is possible, and of course this cannot be taken. Sorry, I didn't mean to rush through. This cannot be taken because rook takes bishop, so you have to go in for this. And suddenly black gets this pawn and this pawn going, and this bishop and rook are perfectly supporting it. This rook can come to b8, and these pawns look very scary. So just a very scary position to play. So it's honestly very hard for white to find a good way to reply to this move. If something else were played, let's say something like, I guess, bishop c3, this could be taken, and then something after. I mean, this isn't hanging at the moment because of just takes, and then rook c7 wins the b7 bishop. So that's not working at the moment, but you could threaten that move with bishop e7 first, and now this is actually annoying to hold. And again, there's this pin with this bishop. The rook is looking at this rook. Very annoying to play. So that is what. Also, just to note, if you take this, it's all good and dandy, but actually, again, white's pieces are not making much sense here. White can't really just keep going with this because this can be taken. So, you have to play something like rook c3, for example, and now b4, and who knows what's going on. I mean, this bishop is under attack. It's just a very uncomfortable position to play for white. It's not that simple. And these bishops are actually looking very good. So for example, if something like bishop c4 offering an exchange of rooks, black can just go into this and then take on f3, and suddenly white's king side looks pretty rough. But anyways, this did not happen in the game. So knight e7 was played anyways, but maybe a5 was a better try. And now knight d4, just basically pressuring the e6 pawn a little bit more. You really cannot hold this. If you play something like bishop c8, you can see how this is looking awful because the rooks are disconnected. Black is losing his coordination trying to hold this pawn. And I think even something like takes is actually a good move here. Let's say if takes, you can just play knight takes, and this is a very disgusting discovered check. The rook is under attack, and white is just completely winning here. So that's not working. So bishop d5 was played, just offering an exchange of pieces. Excuse me. And after this was exchanged, it looks like black did something because he got rid of his light squared bishop, and maybe you could argue that the bishop wasn't that great because it is kind of staring at, nothing in particular. There's no pressure on the white. There's not that much pressure on the white king side, and all the pawns are on light squares, so maybe getting rid of that bishop was a good idea. But there are some downsides to it. It's because now black got rid of one of his best pieces. I'd argue that his light squared bishop was much better than white's. But anyways, let's see how the game went. So rook ac1, Ding just gets on the open c file. He cannot be contested here. This cannot be contested. He cannot block it at all. And here rook d7 was played. If something like knight b6, which I thought maybe hop into c4, right? If you get on a light square, the bishop can't exchange you. Might be a little bit annoying. But now knight c6 comes, and this is even more annoying because now the rook is hit. And what do you really do here? So you have to play something like rook c8, and then f4 comes, you lock this up, and this square, black is never getting e5 in, nor is he getting g5 in. So what does black really do here? White has a nice knight, two very nice rooks, and a beautiful bishop, and this bishop actually does have a target. The king has to keep an eye on g7. In this case, you can see how white's g-pawn is safe. Nothing's touching it. So rook d7 was played probably just to prevent an incursion by the rook, but also maybe in some cases to play rook c7 and contest these two rooks. So not a bad idea. Knight b3 was played here, and now bishop e7. If something like this were played, you could actually just take this, and let's say bishop takes c7. White can just continue with h5, and this knight cannot move because this bishop it needs to be guarded. And if something like, let's say, bishop d6, which looks pretty logical, the rook enters this way. And now this is becoming very frustrating because knight d4 is coming, hitting the e6 pawn. It's not easy to hold this bishop. So if, let's say, king e7, then this pawn drops. So you can see how, slowly, white has this sort of initiative where if black makes any sort of errors, then it just completely goes astray. Well, what else can he try? I mean, e5 is a possibility here, but then knight c5 comes, and if you exchange this off, well, then white gets this really nice passed pawn here. So not an easy position to play for black, especially with how well white's pieces are coordinating, especially these three pieces. And this knight has good squares to hop into. You never know. Maybe he'll hop into c6 this way. Maybe he'll go this way. Maybe knight c5. Black always has to be aware of these sort of ideas by white. So h5 was played, just locking down the king side, and this bishop will no longer look at this. White really doesn't want to play something like g3. This is just passive in a way. It's just sitting here. This is a more ambitious way to play, just to play like this, because with g3 you never know that black can play g5 and maybe start breaking down the white king side. So h5 locks down black's king side. So bishop f6, black would be very happy to get rid of this bishop in a way that helps him. So if this is taken, for example, then knight takes. And actually this knight, now white's attacking potential is gone because, well, not gone, but this pawn is being looked at. The knight can come to e4. Black has some play here, and actually he does have some control of this file. So that's not really what white wants. Instead he played here bishop d4, which is a good move. Now, if this were exchanged, this is a different story, because now the knight gets a much better square than it was on b3, and knight c6 is coming. You can't play e5 here because f5 just falls, and you never know, the knight might even hop around and land on e5. So this is actually kind of annoying. You don't really want to exchange on that square. So e5 was played. It looks good from black's point of view to just take the center like this. But actually, this is fine for him. Bishop c5 comes. Bishop d8 here. Now, if black tries to exchange pieces with something, let's say like bishop e7, you can take this and let's say king takes, for example. Now you can play here rook c5, and again, this is really annoying because, you know, the e-pawn looks a little bit vulnerable. You can even try moves. You could even start to bring your king across, and again, it's really hard to contest white on the c file. And white has very good squares for his knights, or for his knight. Sorry. So bishop c5, bishop d8. I think the idea of bishop d8 is once again to play rook c7 at some point. Maybe reroute the bishop to b6 where it could be exchanged off. So rook d2, and after rook d2, knight f6 was played. Now, what happens if something like bishop b6, which looks good? Well, now this could be taken. So this tactic doesn't actually work. If this is taken, then white just takes the bishop on b6, and rook c7 is coming. The knight again can land on a5 or c5. White has a winning position. 2 pieces for the rook in an endgame is usually winning. So that's why knight f6 was played, offering an exchange, and Ding just went for it. I mean, he just decided that he doesn't actually need that rook. He brings the other rook to d1, and the knight has to move again. The king can really not afford coming up because of rook d6. a6 is being looked at, so it's really not good. You can't step to e7, so you have to go to f7, and then this knight is just taken. If you go to e7, which is probably forced, then just rook takes a6 is just a winning move. So not ideal. That's why you can't really defend that knight. You have to move it. So knight f6 was played. Now bishop d6, eyeing up this e-pawn. Now black really doesn't want to push this pawn. It looks like it defends the pawn, but it gives up this d4 square, and that way the knight has a lot of entry squares. Yeah, the knight will be beautiful on d4. It'll be completely untouchable. So that is why knight g4 was played instead to defend it. Now you can't play f3 to kick the knight because of knight takes e3. So bishop c5 was played, and again, white is just trying to enter on the 7th rank. You can see how Ding is constantly creating problems. This is what I love about this playstyle. He's just, even in an endgame like this, where the evaluation is 0-0, Ding is still creating issues for black. So bishop h4, attacking f2, and also trying to get rook d8 in at some point. Rook d7 comes. And now the king goes back. Now, it looks like, okay, well, what happens if I play king e6? Then rook d6 comes, and this doesn't matter anyways, g3. This is actually sort of what happens in the game. The pieces will be pushed back, and white achieves getting his rook on the 7th rank, which is this is a massive achievement. The eval still says, like, basically plus 0.1, which is a draw. But playing this as black is going to be very difficult because white's pieces are far more superior than black's. And white has the 7th rank, and he can also just keep on playing this position like forever. Black has to still solve a lot of his problems here. But let's go back here. So in this position, rook d7 was played. I showed what happened with king e6. So king g8 was played. And now g3. Bishop g5, and this is just like the game, except white's rook is just, it was on d6, but now it's on d7. And now king f1. Ding just wants to bring his king into the position. And yeah, and also maybe in some cases, you never know, black might try to sacrifice something on e3, and there might be a check. You never know. So might as well just start bringing the king into the game. And here Nakamura played this weird move, bishop d8. I don't really understand this move. I'm guessing he thought the bishop was just poorly placed on g5 because it does look at nothing. This is defended. On f6 it wouldn't make sense because the knight wants to go to f6 and it can't go to e7, so maybe d8 is the best square. That's what he thought, you know, he should do. But I was wondering why not play something like rook d8. Seems reasonable to me. You can't really avoid this exchange of rooks. If you try something like rook b7 here, then rook d3 comes and the knight is hit. Okay, let's say knight a5, and now the pawn is taken. So, okay, that's actually kind of annoying because now you never know. The rook actually can enter, and this knight looks good. And, you know, f2 might be weak. Not so clear, honestly. I don't know why rook d8 wasn't played. And, you know, if you try anything else, I mean, where do you really go? I mean, if you take this, then this is exactly what black wants. Now this is a much easier position to hold because at least black has removed the rook from the 7th rank. this pawn might become a weakness. And, you know, it's kind of like white's pieces are staring into nothing. This knight still has to kind of like go somewhere. And black has a pretty good center, controlling a lot of squares here. And I think this king is a lot slower to come into the game than this king. So, like, this king can just come through, and this king will have to find out how to avoid this barricade of pawns without giving up the f2 square. So, I thought rook d8 should have been played here, but bishop d8 was played. And now rook b7, very good move. Now, the point is that at some point black is going to play knight f6 anyways. The knight is not doing anything here. And white will have to move the rook anyways. So in this case, he moved to b7. There's no other square here. If you look at all these squares are actually covered. Not b7, but yeah, I mean rook b7 just a good move, just maintaining this rook on the 7th rank. And now f4 was played, and I think Hikaru probably realized that he was in some trouble here. It's really hard to suggest a good move here. I mean, if you play knight f6 and continue with this, then something like bishop d6, you can start attacking this pawn. Really uncomfortable to play this position. You can't actually even defend this pawn properly. If this is taken, then this is taken. You can see how the coordination of the white pieces are very strong. The g7 square is weak, and black doesn't have a good way of defending this. If you really try something like this, you can just take this, and after, let's say, knight takes, you can just bring the knight into the game, and suddenly f5 is hit, knight e6 is still coming, and you never know, the rook may come to b6 after this rook has moved and attack the a-pawn. Yeah, usually when one side has a rook on the 7th rank but the other doesn't, that side is usually the one who can continue causing problems. This king is cut off from the game, but this king can just start entering the position. But yeah, so instead f4 was played just to try some tricks on the king side. This was taken. Now, if this is taken, I think Hikaru probably hoped that with this very shattered structure on the king side, he would have some chance to pick off some of these weak pawns, maybe create some issues. You never know. Bishop h4 might come again, attacking this pawn. It's just, it's not clean. So I think that's why Ding here played e4, just to lock things down. And now bishop f6. The computer's just playing here f3. But doing this is a little bit, it looks a little bit, it's tough to do this because this pawn might be a weakness. You really never know when white can play something like this. Like, what happens if knight d4 here? You really have to see what is black supposed to do. Knight e5? Okay. But now this pawn is kind of tied down with this knight. And, this bishop can't defend it because it's on a light square. So, you never know. The king can just come across and try to pick it up like that. Not very clear. So I understand why Hikaru didn't play f3 here. But f3 would have probably saved him, not the game, but would have created some problems for white because his king wouldn't be able to get into the game so easily. So bishop f6. Now knight d4. Rook e8. Just attacking the pawn. And now here, really good move. Of course, if this is taken, then f3 just wins. Or not f3, sorry, king f3 just wins. And yeah, basically this is just a very simple fork. Black cannot save himself here. My notes say the reason f3 doesn't work is because of knight e3, and this saves black. So that doesn't work. But anyways, so king g2, and now the knight comes back. Now maybe he wants to push here, but it's honestly a bit too late. Knight f5 was played. This allows him to play f3 easily without having his pawn captured. But now that you can see the king is on g3 and not on f1. So the king has actually succeeded in escaping out of his little hole on the king's side. So knight c4, and I think black was trying to gun for this pawn. And bishop b7, a very strong move, just trying to remove this bishop. Now, bishop b2 was played here. Now, what happens if, for example, bishop takes e7, let's say. Then knight takes, and suddenly the knight enters a very strong square on g6. Kind of reminds me of that Hikaru Duda game, where Hikaru had a nice knight on g6 as well. But anyways, and then you can just take this pawn, and suddenly these pawns are actually looking really annoying. You can take this, but it doesn't matter because king f4, let's say the knight tries to come back and take the b pawn. Knight e7 check again, and the knight comes back and holds everything together. And because a5 is not possible, it just gets taken. The rook is covering the b pawn from running. And again, this rook is beautifully placed. Now this h pawn is actually looks very annoying because the g6 square is covered. And it's just very hard for black to do anything here. He can try these checks, but the king will just step away. And if he tries to go back, you can actually just play here rook e7, not rook e7, sorry. Rook c7 or rook e7, I think, is actually a fine. No, I think that's actually a loss because the a pawn runs. Anyway, so rook c7 will come, and after something like knight d4, then knight e7, and again, like, these pawns are rolling. It's still complicated because you never know when black might have this trick with pushing the a pawn and pushing the b pawn. There is still a game to play here. But okay, so this wasn't taken. So what else can he try here? What if we check first? Well, then the king just takes the pawn and there's nothing to do. You can try the same thing with here, but in this case, white just got this extra pawn with an extra move. Okay, what if instead black just goes pawn hunting with something like knight takes a3? Well, then this could be taken and you win the h6 pawn, and this is actually completely devastating. h6 comes and there's just nothing to do here. Black is going to get completely destroyed here. If this is taken, then something like rook b8. You cannot take this because of h7, and there's no way to stop this pawn from queening. And what else is there to do? If king h7, then rook h8, and the king is getting chased. Rook g8 again. This cannot be taken because of h7. So the king has to keep going forward. Let's say king f5, and now knight d6, and that just wins the rook. But again, it's mostly about this pawn just running through. So that's not working. So you can't really allow white to take on f6. So bishop b2 makes sense just to hunt down the a pawn. King takes f3, and white is basically just up a pawn here for nothing. You know, you could take this, and this is how the game went. But white just moves aside, and suddenly these pawns are rolling, and you know it's not enough because the bishop is holding everything together. This queen side is just not going to generate enough counterplay here. Now, what if something like a5? Well, then you can just play bishop c5. You can just ignore this. And if this is taken, now rook g7 is very strong. And you can see how like the coordination of these pieces are beautiful. Very hard for black to untangle. He has too many threats on his king side. So knight e5 was played just to bring some pieces back into the game. Now bishop c5. Very strong move, just holding everything together, and again, threatening the g7 pawn. Knight f7 was played to block this. And now f3, very calm move, very calm play, just holding the e pawn. White can just sit here and play this. Black is actually going to run out of moves. He can't even go king f8 just to give him a passing move. And again, like something like king h8, you can just take this. So that's not working. I mean, honestly, this knight can't move either because the g7 pawn will fall. Very hard for black to find a good move here. Something like knight d8, I'm just naming off moves, but like rook g7 just wins. So the knight can't move. The rook can improve, but it's really like it's kind of a futile battle here. Bishop c1 was played, I guess, to try and prevent this king from coming into the game via f4. Maybe, you know, I'm not actually sure what bishop c1 even does. But it's honestly hard to even suggest a move here. Again, if a5, which looks, obviously you can't take this because the bishop will be taken, then just knight e7, and let's say king h8. You can play here knight c6, and that just holds everything together and attacks the a pawn. So that's not working. So yeah, after f3, bishop c1, rook a7, just hunting the a pawn here. One more thing I want to mention. If rook a8 here, then just f4 and then e5, e6, and there's nothing to do here. Black cannot hold this pawn and also stop these pawns from rolling. So rook a7 and now bishop d2. The pawn was just taken. There wasn't really nothing black can do here. Bishop e1, king g2. Notice how he doesn't go forward because of knight e5, which would give black some counterplay like this. where suddenly this can be taken because there's a check at the end here. So, there's this annoying check. It's not as clean as it could be. So instead he played king g2, which is a good move. I mean, how many of us would have played king f4 without thinking? Or like king g4, something like that. So yeah, really good move, king g2. Bishop c3. I think black is just like hopping around here. I think it was also meant to prevent bishop d4 from coming, and at some point maybe preventing knight d4. But rook a7, the rook just goes back to the 7th rank. Knight g5, knight e7. The knight comes to g6. Knight e7 again. Ding just wants to repeat moves, I guess, for time. And then he plays here knight d5. And this is a really good move, kicking the bishop and holding this b pawn. Now, where does the bishop go? He played bishop b2 because he really needs to prevent bishop d4 from happening. Otherwise, there's no way to defend g7 properly. So he plays here bishop b2. Rook a2 just kicks the bishop again. Now, where does it go? He played bishop c1. What if he tried to maintain it here? What if he tried this? I don't know if f4 is working. I mean, f4, I think you could just take this, and actually you could probably survive for a little bit, playing rook and knight against bishop, knight, and rook. But I think even stronger is just waiting, playing king f2, and just improving your position a little bit. Black has no good moves here. I mean, you can try stuff like this, but again, f4, and these pawns are going to roll. The king will be right behind it. And again, the rook will always swing back to a7. So rook a2, he had to play bishop c1 here to at least try to prevent f4. I don't think he could have even prevented it. I mean, f4 is also not exactly possible here because knight takes c4 is a thing. So rook c2, again, hitting the bishop one more time. Bishop a3, and now bishop e3, kicking the knight. The rook will enter in the 7th rank with rook c7, and, the bishop will come around this way. So knight here. Now, if this was just ignored, let's say, I don't know, let's find a good, I don't even know what to suggest here. Let's say some random move like this. Then I think maybe Ding was intending on just taking this, and honestly, this is a pretty simple endgame to convert. You can just play king g3, king g4, and you could just take this pawn. The knight is untouchable on a light square. This bishop is entombed. It has nowhere to go. These squares are all covered, and this rook is doing nothing, and white can just slowly push these pawns. It's completely losing. So knight f7 was played, trying to preserve more pieces. Well, actually, knight f7 wasn't played. I was in my notes. Bishop e3, and black just resigned. Hikaru just resigned the game. I think it was because after knight f7, rook c7, and again, the attack just continues. I mean, how do you defend g7? There's nothing to do. Rook g8. Knight e7. What are you doing now? Okay, if you try to do this, just knight g6, king g8, and then rook g7 is mate. So no way to hold that g7 pawn. This bishop was completely trapped. Just nothing really to do here. So a really great game by Ding. He actually clutched 2nd place, which could be important if Magnus decides not to play for the world title anymore. So yeah, let's just go back and quickly review this game again. Knight f3 was played here, going into a Tarash after c5. Ding tried to remain a bit solid, and it went into this position, which you would think at first glance is like so symmetrical that it just has to be a draw. But little did we know that Ding would go out to try and grind this game. And basically after this, I think Ding played a perfect game, I think. I mean, he played really well. What is there to say? White just had a very easy way of playing the position. He just conquered the c-file, controlled the c-file entirely. The rooks went to c7 anyways. There was no way to stop this. Yeah, and again, like this rook c7 idea wouldn't work here because the rook comes here, and then it would just be very difficult for black to play. So, I mean, white just kept generating these problems here, and black was just kind of running out of moves little by little. h5, again, great move, avoiding any sort of attack here. Bishop f6, and, it's hard to really say exactly where Hikaru went wrong. I think he was playing okay. I just think Ding put him under some pressure. And as soon as white reaches the 7th rank, it's very difficult for black to play. I think instead of bishop d8, which was probably Hikaru's last and probably his only mistake, his only real mistake here, he should have played something like rook d8 just to contest the rook, get it off the file, and if Ding didn't exchange, Hikaru would have chances to go on the d file. But this wasn't played, bishop d8 instead, and after rook b7, the whole game just went sour. I think f4 was also, I think he just realized that he was basically in a lot of trouble. Again, after knight f6, bishop d6 was coming, so I think f4, trying to create problems, didn't really work out. Ding just shut this all down. He could have taken the pawn, but he shut it down with e4. And again, I think here Hikaru missed his chance to play f3, just to trap the king and not let it escape that easily. And you never know, this f-pawn might have actually been like important in the game. Instead, bishop f6 was played, and Hikaru slowly entered a losing position where he couldn't keep all of white's threats under control, and he couldn't generate counterplay for himself. You know, maybe it's really hard to suggest any moves here for black. Knight e5 was a try, and you know, it just became very difficult for him to play this because the rook is beautifully placed with the knight. There was no way to kick this knight, and this bishop was just shooting blanks while this bishop was trying to find targets. And white's pieces are just much better coordinated than black's. Black has a king that's like still stuck in his camp, a bishop that is shooting at nothing, a knight that has to guard the g7 pawn, and a rook that isn't shooting at anything either. I mean, and Hikaru just completely collapsed here. Basically, there was nothing to do. As soon as Ding just consolidated his position and slowly kicked this bishop away. Again, black can't even keep this bishop alive. Like we just looked at this move, bishop e5 and f4 is a winning move there. But anything else, I mean, if you try even something like bishop here, I think this could just be taken. You could just take this and then play something like rook a6 and start attacking the f6 pawn. If king g7, you can play rook b6 and try to attack this pawn. Basically, black's position is collapsing, and there's nothing that he can do about it. Yeah, after bishop c1, the bishop was just trapped on a3. It was just out of the game permanently, and black is basically playing down a piece. Bishop e3, good move, like basically trying to get more exchanges in, allowing the rook to come into c7. Yeah, and after this, I mean, after keep messing this up, bishop e3, black resigned. But yeah, what a great game by Ding. What a strong finish, by the way. I think if Ding didn't lose the first game to Nepo, and maybe he had like maybe one more win or something, would have been very interesting to see this. But congratulations to Nepo. He very much deserved to win the Candidates Tournament. So yeah, so that's the conclusion of the tournament. Thank you so much for watching all my videos. I was really happy to cover all the rounds and, you know, try to pick out interesting games for you guys to see. So yeah, I'll see you guys later. I might do different versions of, I might cover like different different tournaments. This is like a passion project for me, really. I'm not really doing this for views or subs or anything. But it would be nice to have them, though. But yeah, I'll leave you off at this position. I'll see you next time. All right, so take care. Thank you for watching. Bye.